Ketamine. I am going to butcher this molecule's name. 2,2-chlorphenyl 2-methylaminocyclohexane 1,1, also known as ketamine, is a dissociative anesthetic with psychedelic-like effects. So ketamine is in that lumpers category. Even the experiences itself of what we would call its psychedelic-like effects are not particularly akin to that of, say, psilocybin, but it definitely fits the category of altering consciousness into other states of reality, seemingly. It is neither tryptamine nor phenethylamine. It has a distinctive cyclohexane ring with a chlorinated phenyl group attached. It's actually much more closely related to PCP, phencyclidine, I think that's PCP, or colloquially called angel dust back in the 90s at least, and is actually, I believe, an analog of PCP. It is a very important medicine, actually. It's considered a staple medicine by the World Health Organization. So this is because ketamine as a dissociative anesthetic is actually very safe. By this, I mean that when we consider things like fentanyl or morphine, what's the other one called? It's not bupropion. Anyways, there are other anesthetics that definitely anesthetize a person and make them unconscious, but the risk of respiratory suppression or other serious medical events under the effects of these anesthetics is significant. Ketamine does not have those same risks, at least purely on its own. There are risks when it's combined with other respiratory suppressant or depressant agents. But you can generally safely give ketamine to someone who is on the battlefield and otherwise going to die. For example, in World War I, they gave people morphine. People died from the morphine directly. In Vietnam, for example, they gave ketamine and people would not die from the ketamine. They'd probably die from their limbs being forcefully removed by explosions, perhaps, but it wasn't the ketamine that suppressed their respiration. What makes it a staple medicine is that it's also very cheap to produce and safe to administer. So the World Health Organization considers it a staple medicine for third world countries because it is such an accessible emergency medicine. It makes it safe for use in people with compromised medical or physiology, makes it safer for elderly people and even for children. Rumor has it that China tried to get it broadly criminalized around the world as a part of the sort of UN sort of agreement on what drugs would be criminalized, and it was shot down because the World Health Organization saw it as such an important medicine. The rumor is that China was trying to do this because of problems they have with ketamine in their country, ketamine addiction. Don't know that to be true. You can look it up if you like. But nonetheless, it is considered as a staple medicine because of its safety and efficacy. A lot of people call ketamine a horse tranquilizer, right? And this is because they misunderstand that although ketamine is used in veterinary medicine, again, because it's a very safe and cheap and accessible anesthetic, that it must be like it gets stolen from the vets and you're actually getting high on horse tranquilizer, but it as a dissociative anesthetic is used broadly across a number of different domains. Okay, so getting into ketamine's mechanisms of action, this is pretty complex, and I'm going to do my best to describe it. But unlike DMT, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine doesn't impact serotonin. I mean, it impacts a number of different neural systems, but its predominant effect is what's on the NMDA receptor, which is a part of the glutamate system. Glutamate is our main excitatory neurotransmitter. It tells the brain to go. Secondary to glutamate would be GABA. GABA tells the brain, don't go. So that would be our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. When ketamine binds to the NMDA receptor, it makes it so that in certain areas of the brain, there's an increase in glutamate, But the area that it binds to is related to the GABAergic system. So it blocks the inhibitory effects of GABA. So it increases the excitatory neurotransmitter in the prefrontal cortex while also inhibiting the inhibitory effect of GABA. You would think that would lead to excessive excitation, but it seems to make it so that the brain can no longer communicate with itself. The way that it selectively acts is that it creates a disrupted connectivity. And since our ability to be consciously aware is dependent upon our brain communicating with itself in a particular way, it simultaneously increases mental activity while decreasing the sort of by also detaching the brain's connection with the body. This also has to do with how ketamine affects the thalamus, which is kind of like the brain's relay station. So it cuts off information flow to the cortex from the body. It disconnects the body's experience from the brain's experience while also ramping up the brain's, like the prefrontal cortex sort of mental experience. So we have this increase in sort of subjective experience and a decrease in that experience being tied to the sensations of the body or even the experience of the body. So you get this disconnection. At doses high enough, the disconnection is so dramatic that the conscious awareness is suppressed completely. And despite the fact that there might be increased glutamatergic activity, we have no conscious awareness at all because we are so like the disconnection becomes so great. At lower doses, we get this weird alteration of the experience. We'll talk about it in a bit. But at anesthetic doses, we get completely unconscious. However, because of this weird combination of increasing mental activity while detaching or disconnecting it from body experience or sort of like signals from the physical body, at slightly sub-anesthetic doses, we have the experience of entering domains of experience entirely defined by just mental processing rather than any kind of like connection between our sensory environment and mental experience. So again, very complex. I don't know how well I described it there, so I'll let you neuropharmacologists correct me in the comments. But this is the primary action of ketamine through the NMDA receptor to disconnect mental experience from the body, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness, but just before unconsciousness to the point of dramatically increasing mental experience while completely detaching or dissociating it from physical experience or the experiences of the body. Now, the experience of ketamine itself is interesting, very interesting. It can range from mild to significant distortions or dissociation from the body. So it can alleviate pain, alter physical sensation. It can create a strong sensation of feeling floaty or even a bit drunk with some mild perceptual distortions. One of the aspects, and what's interesting about this is one of the aspects of it as a lumbered psychedelic experience is that whereas things like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or DMT tend to increase our emotional experience, ketamine decreases our emotional experience. Our emotions and our feelings are tied to our physical sensations. They're tied to the signals coming from our physical body into the mental or our mental experience up in the brain. It's hard not to separate. Like it's hard not to make this weird separation between brain and body. I mean, brain is obviously a part of the body. But this disconnection that happens makes it so that although we have increased mental activity, these incredible experiences, and even there could be the sense that there are particular feelings involved, we don't actually feel them so much. We're dissociated from our feelings. This makes it ideal sometimes for certain forms of therapy where you might want to go in and work on a thing that normally is the feelings of it are too much. But when we're on a small enough a dose of ketamine or the right dosage, we can get into it where the feelings no longer flood us. Now, as this gets into higher doses, the detachment between the physical body's sensation or perception of the surrounding kind of environment and the mental experience can become so dramatic that we enter basically phenomenological worlds entirely untethered from the senses of our physical body, generating out of body experiences and seemingly entry into different realities, ones that can but don't always include autobiographical material, which means we can enter into other realities that have no sort of sense of being related to our history or emergence from our memories or anything like that. We're just in totally different worlds, spaces with possible angles, and even at certain points where even the sort of relative position of like a single point of consciousness to the dimensional, like the dimensions of the space that we're in are untied, and there's no singleized local state of consciousness, at least local state of awareness, at least as I've had it described to me. Nonetheless, when we go into these higher doses that are just below the dosage that would create unconsciousness, that is when we enter into what one would call a peak psychedelic experience on ketamine, what other people call the K-hole. K-hole has a derogatory term because it really does feel like you're sinking out of experience. You like physically, if you've ever seen somebody go through it, it looks like they're just sinking away. But generally it's called a K-hole because most people who are using ketamine recreationally are using it trying to like just almost like being on trippy cocaine or something. Like it's stimulating, it's got a dopaminergic effect. It kind of like engages you, makes things kind of weird, and you want to like get around and talk with people and your body feels all strange. I think I had one person describe it to me as like 6 beers on the tip of your pinky finger. And then they take too much and they sink away, and it's a bad thing. They call it a K-hole. But people who are more psychonautic recognize that this is when well contained and you're ready to go in there. Entering into this K-hole is something like entering into the peak psychedelic experience of ketamine. Now, one might wonder what its, medical use is. Okay, so we have its use as a dissociative anesthetic, as a staple medicine. And we have the realization that it can create these weird psychedelic type experiences. And I already alluded a little bit to how it could be used in therapy. But what was really curious is that despite this ketamine being first synthesized in 1962 as a safer alternative to PCP, which was being used as an anesthetic at the time, it was approved for medical use as an anesthetic in 1970. Like I said, became widely used as a battlefield anesthetic in the Vietnam War. It always had this recognition of the psychedelic effects, which kind of got it popular in underground use, but generally medically, it was still used as an anesthetic. This is until in the early 2000s, they discovered that a dose of ketamine can temporarily lift treatment-resistant depression and associated suicidality within hours. What this means is that they discovered, that somebody who was suicidally depressed and could find no relief elsewhere, somehow, given a dose of this anesthetic drug, even at doses that don't produce anesthesia, alleviated their depression and suicidality, sometimes for up to 2 weeks before it comes back. Now, besides the fact that this created an opportunity to start exploring ketamine as an antidepressant drug, it opened an entirely new perspective on depression treatment. This is because initially, depression was generally seen as, if you've ever heard like the serotonin theory or serotonin depletion or inadequate serotonin theory of depression, effectively that there's not enough serotonin in the brain. That's why people are depressed. And so they give them SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is selectively targeting specific serotonin receptors to prevent them from reuptaking, which is to clean up the serotonin molecules out of the synaptic cleft. If we inhibit that, we increase serotonin in the brain. They see that you increase serotonin in the brain with these drugs, and people are less depressed in a month or 2 time. That goes to stand that, it must be the increased serotonin that creates the antidepressant effects. Now, Lots of issues with SSRIs and their effects on depression can be anywhere from totally ineffective to very effective to, effective, but with side effects that make it people wonder whether or not its, price is worth its gain is worth the cost. But that aside, there's increasing evidence that this theory of serotonin being the predominant driver of depression is actually false, and that the benefits on depression we're seeing from SSRIs are not from the serotonin, but as a secondary effect of what the increased presence of serotonin seems to be doing to neural functioning in general, perhaps through glutamate, perhaps through neuroplasticity, perhaps through the reduction of stress. Who knows? Either way, ketamine introduced this whole new way of thinking about depression. This drug it has effects on serotonin, but it's not a serotonergic drug. It is a drug that is through the glutamate system producing like anesthesia, dissociative anesthesia. And even if there's nothing about the experience at all that relates anything to depression, people can have reduced depressive symptoms for weeks afterwards only after a single dose. That led to a exploration of the role of neuroplasticity in depression, specifically that it seemed as though the rapid increases in neuroplasticity that the ketamine seemed to offer, and how it could help restore synaptic connections in regions like the prefrontal cortex that show atrophy in depression. It might actually be through these neuroplastic effects that ketamine is alleviating depression, at least temporarily. So out of that, and also because ketamine was already legalized, which makes it much more simple to go from it being legal to treat one condition to it being legal to treat another, rather than with MDMA or psilocybin, it is completely illegal, and now we have to justify its use broad scale, not just in different conditions. It made it so that ketamine could be researched, and researching its effects on neural tissue and on experience into other conditions. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, even chronic pain disorders, as an adjunct to psychotherapy, or even as a just sort of on its own thing. People go in and they get their IV ketamine and they're under for an hour, and then they come back in 2 weeks when their depression comes back. On top of that, it created a whole new emergency medicine use for ketamine, which is to prevent acute suicidality in emergency medicine. So you can see here on the right of the screen, on the right of the slide, we've got S-ketamine, which is, so ketamine is, I don't remember the term, but molecules have these two sides. It's like a left hand and a right hand. When each of these sides is called an enantiomer. With ketamine, you have an R side and an S side. Similar with, if you've ever heard of Adderall. So Adderall is a brand name for a selective mixture of amphetamine, which has a D side, dextroamphetamine, and L side, levoamphetamine. And they break these two molecules apart, and they selectively add more of the dextroamphetamine to what otherwise would have been an even mix, racematic in the sort of regular amphetamine, and you get this proprietary blend called Adderall. With S-ketamine, what we have is the R and the S enantiomers broken off, and just the S side, the S-ketamine, being delivered now as a proprietary drug for the treatment of depression through this spray. Now, a lot of people, and I think rightfully so, express concern over how ketamine is finding its way in the sort of psychedelic renaissance. And it's not because people don't believe in ketamine as a potential treatment. It is questionable because the nasal spray of ketamine itself can be highly addictive, and the nasal spray is a more addictive route. The faster you can administer a drug, the higher the developments of dependency and addiction. But it's because the current regulations around ketamine, especially in the United States, make it very easy to start prescribing it for conditions that it's not approved for. And with privatized medicine, it becomes easy to leverage the popularity of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapy, using ketamine, which is technically legal to give to people, although its efficacy long-term is clearly not strong because it usually only lasts for like a week or two. And you end up in scenarios where people have these boutique clinics that are charging thousands and thousands of dollars for people to go in and get their ketamine, but they'll have to just keep coming back every 2 weeks. So there's issues of dependence, addiction, profit motives. Profit motives will always be something to be concerned about in our society, at least the way that it's configured now. But these concerns are different than with psilocybin and MDMA, presently at least.